Fisheries and Oceans Committee meeting. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 66 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans. The meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of June 23, 2022. We will begin today's meeting in public to hear witness testimony for our new study, Foreign Ownership and Corporation Concentration of Fishing Licences and Quota. Afterwards, we will switch to in-camera to discuss committee business for the last hour of the meeting. As a reminder to all, please address your comments through the chair. Screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. In accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses, I'm informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on January 20, 2022, the committee is beginning the study of foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fishing licences and quota. I would like to welcome our first panel of witnesses from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. We have Neil Davis, Regional Director of Fisheries Management Branch Pacific Region by video conference. We have Maurice Lemire, Regional Director of Fisheries Management by video conference. We have Doug Wenzel, Regional Director General Maritimes Region, also by video conference. And here in person we have Jennifer Mooney, Director National Licensing Operations, and Mark Waddell, Director General Fisheries Policy. I thank you for taking the time to appear today. You have 5 minutes for your opening statement, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and committee members. I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we gather as the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I would also like to acknowledge the tragic loss of life this past weekend of 2 harvesters in New Brunswick and extend my condolences to all parties. My colleagues and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada regarding your study of foreign ownership and corporate concentration of fishing licenses and quota, and would like to take this opportunity to thank the committee for your ongoing work to address these important issues, and will be pleased to address any questions you may have. Fisheries and Oceans Canada is committed to supporting the Minister's socioeconomic, cultural and conservation objectives of its commercial fisheries, and to working on strategic improvements in managing this public resource on behalf of Canadians. The issue of foreign ownership of Canadian fisheries access was highlighted as part of this committee's 2019 report, West Coast Fisheries, Sharing Risks and Benefits. The government response to this report affirmed that the committee's recommendations were aligned with several ongoing government priorities and acknowledged the challenges being faced by independent harvesters in Pacific commercial fisheries. The department's foreign ownership restrictions on commercial fisheries access are established through its licensing policies and guide the minister's discretionary authority to issue licenses. In Atlantic Canada, DFO's licensing policies explicitly require that the fisheries resources remain available to Canadians. In Atlantic midshore and offshore fisheries, corporations that hold licenses are required by current policy to be at least 51% Canadian-owned. This requirement has been in place for over 35 years and was instituted to ensure that effective control of commercial access is retained by Canadian companies while still allowing for investment in emerging fisheries or fisheries lacking capital. In Atlantic inshore fisheries, the department regulates who can hold inshore commercial fishing licenses via the inshore regulations, which require license holders to be independent owner-operators who meet regional residency requirements. In the Pacific region, fisheries management and licensing policies are built around conservation objectives. The licensing system that governs most Pacific fisheries allows license holders to exchange fisheries access, further promoting the economic viability of fishing operations and limiting stress on stocks. The intent of Pacific commercial licensing policies is to facilitate responsible management and conservation of fisheries resources. In Pacific fisheries, DFO employs both party-based and vessel-based fishing licenses. For party-based fisheries, the department requires that all corporations that are issued licenses be registered in Canada. The Department does not have a policy on the citizenship of individuals who apply for Pacific licenses. In Pacific vessel-based fisheries, licenses are instead issued directly to vessels that must be already registered with Transport Canada. Transport Canada requires all registered vessels be owned by either a Canadian resident or corporation or a foreign registered corporation with a Canadian subsidiary or representative entity. Transport Canada does not restrict the foreign ownership of a Canadian registered fishing vessel. In July 2020, following the release of the government response, DFO launched a review of its existing foreign ownership policies. The Department concluded that it lacked the information required to effectively assess the concerns put forth by this committee's report and sought to fill missing data gaps while still addressing urgent concerns where possible. In February 2021, the Minister approved a measure to increase scrutiny of potential foreign investments in the Atlantic midshore, offshore, and exempted fleet commercial fisheries. The revised measure applies the existing foreign ownership limit to the full corporate structure for all future license applicants, as well as existing license holders that wish to acquire additional access. The Department also began work with federal forensic accounting experts to develop a mandatory survey that would identify who is benefiting from commercial fishing licenses and quota, incorporating input from key stakeholders. This survey sought information on the identification, citizenship, and/or country of registration for all direct and indirect owners of commercial licenses. The survey also sought broad information on the license holders' debts, ongoing fishing agreements, and executive-level employees. Ultimately, the survey will identify the beneficial owners, the individual people who directly or indirectly control fisheries access. Over 2,500 commercial license holders from Pacific, party-based, and vessel-based fisheries, as well as Atlantic midshore, offshore, and exempted fleets and the Elver fisheries, were required to complete the survey. The survey's overall response rate is 80% across the implicated license holders from all three coasts. The 83% of Atlantic enterprises that completed a survey account for a combined total of 90% of Atlantic midshore, offshore, and exempted fleet commercial licenses. Similarly, the 79% of Pacific enterprises that completed the survey account for a combined total of 88% of implicated Pacific commercial licenses. The data collected from the survey were delivered to federal forensic accounting experts for analysis in December, and aggregated results will be publicly released this spring. The Department will then engage stakeholders to discuss the findings and evaluate whether policy solutions are warranted. As the committee can expect, careful consideration of the impacts of potential policy solutions are required before changes can be introduced. To conclude, the Department is committed to better understanding the challenges facing commercial access holders. DFO's decision to enhance the application of foreign ownership restrictions in Atlantic fisheries, combined with the launch of the Beneficial Ownership Survey, should be a signal that the Department takes the input of this committee very seriously. I thank you for your attention. I'll be pleased to answer questions.
Thank you for that. We'll now go to our first round of questioning. Before I go to Mr. Small, though, I will remind members that try to be brief and identify who you want to answer the question. We've got 3 hours of committee business today, and we're going to be tight on time. We have to be finished by 2 o'clock, obviously. We all got to be somewhere else. So, again, be generous with your time, and we'll get through it. So I'll go to Mr. Small now for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And on behalf of FOPO committee members, I'd like to extend my condolences to the family of the lobster fishermen who were lost at sea in the opening as well. It's a tragedy, and people tied to the marine industry know it all too well. Mr. Chair, my first question is to Ms. Mooney. Ms. Mooney, have you heard talk of supply agreements in the Newfoundland and Labrador fishery between harvesters and processors?
Yes, in terms of concerns with the inshore fishery in particular, yes, I have heard those concerns.
Are these agreements legal under the recent DFO policy?
If we're talking about the inshore fishery, harvesters have a number of ways to access loan agreements through registered or non-registered financial institutions. And in some cases, harvesters, yes, they can access loan agreements from processors, for example.
Ms. Mooney, again, Mr. Chair, do you think that the owner-operator policy is being compromised in a roundabout way by supply agreements?
I do think that the supply agreements are in place for harvesters to access loans and to exercise fishing. I think what's really important to note here is that those harvesters have to be independent core harvesters. They have to be in charge of their business decisions on the water and off the water. And so one of the really important points to note also is that being in charge of those business decisions means they are making financial decisions for their business.
In talking with harvesters and wanting harvesters to come to this committee and testify, there's a great fear. We couldn't source harvesters who want to talk about these types of things, even in camera meetings where they wouldn't be identified. The fear was so great that it would get back to the processing sector that witness A, B, C, and D was Mr. Smith. Why do you think there's that fear amongst people to actually give meaningful testimony to this committee?
Thank you for the question, Chair. I can't speculate as to why that would be the case. What I can say is that we do have information hotlines where harvesters, if there are concerns, they can report that information anonymously to the department. That is not my role. That is a role for conservation and protection at DFO, who has a role for enforcement. What I can also say very quickly is that we do spot check, we do review every time there is a request for a license holder to reissue their license, a transfer. We do review the eligibility of that license holder against the inshore regulations, so both the current and the prospective license holder.
So I guess again to Ms. Mooney, Mr. Chair. So Royal Greenland, the largest seafood company in the North Atlantic, can own 49% of every company in eastern Canada, basically. If a company like Royal Greenland made such large purchases and investments in the Atlantic fishery, they would, if they bought 49% in all of those companies, and some of them own offshore quotas, don't you think that would constitute major foreign ownership? Do you think that that's good policy?
Perhaps my colleague has more to add here, but what I would say is with respect to Royal Greenland and that transaction, of course, that was under provincial jurisdiction in which that was made.
But the quotas, for example, Ms. Mooney, if there's offshore quotas attached to some of those companies and or community quotas, then Royal Greenland is buying directly into quotas that are owned, and they're owning 49% of that asset.
What I would add here is that all offshore and midshore licenses and quotas respect the requirements of the foreign ownership requirements.
Okay, so last year when the Capelin fishery was about to start, it basically closed down, Mr. Chair. And again, this is a licensing to Ms. Mooney. Some buyers wanted to have a Capelin fishery, some didn't. But I understand that the buyers, the processors, had some control, some power in if that, in fact, that fishery would open up or not. But the quotas were held by the harvesters. So why would, because that's a form of corporate control in the fishery when 2/3 of the processors don't want a fishery to open. Do you think that's corporate control?
Again, here I wouldn't speculate, and perhaps I would turn this to my colleagues if they have anything further to add there.
If I may, Mr. Chair, at least with regards to the previous line of inquiry. So the department undertook that beneficial ownership survey in an effort to determine the extent of potential foreign ownership within Canada's fisheries. While that body of work does continue to reside with our forensic accounting colleagues at PSPC, we do have preliminary results for Atlantic Canada. And I can say that based on the survey findings, 98% of Canadian offshore, midshore, and exempted fleet licenses are held by Canadian individuals or Canadian corporations. Less than 2% are held by foreign entities.
We'll now go to Mr. Cormier for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I would also like to add my condolences for the two fishers that lost their lives at sea. It was a very tough weekend in my riding, and I want to ensure that all the MPs are behind you, and we want to assure the fishing community that we support them. Ms. Mooney, I think you said earlier that fishers have to be in full control of their business decisions when it's time to ensure that all complies with the rules and regulations when they deal with a corporation or a commercial enterprise. What do you mean by full control of their decisions? A few examples, perhaps?
In terms of their business decisions on the water, for example, it would be things such as hiring their crew, designating their sub-operators. In terms of their decisions off the water, it would be making their, determining who, if they're enter into any loan agreements, who those would be with, and they are realizing the benefits of that license. So that is key, that they are the direct beneficiaries of that license.
Parfait, mais si une corporation...
Thank you. But a corporation which is linked, or if the fishers are...
Work that our regional licensing office staff do is they look to make sure, for example, if license holders are entering into loan agreements with non-registered financial institutions in particular, that their loan agreements are being paid down. And so the whole idea here is that license holders have flexibilities in terms of being able to access financing, but they are not beholden to those broader interests over the long term. And as a final point, just to emphasize, corporations cannot hold inshore licenses in this country. They are held by the individual directly.
Juste pour venir vite fait avant ma prochaine question.
But to come back to Royal Greenland, we hear more and more talk about this particular corporation in our region. We want to ensure that the Canadian fisheries are held by Canadians. Of course, there are foreigners that do have some proprietorship. But don't you think that there's beginning to create a monopoly? Royal Greenland is a sovereign corporation, and don't you think that's unfair business practice then? What can we do with our processing plants and our fishers in our regions? How can we defend ourselves?
Perhaps this is a more appropriate question to provide to my colleagues.
I can take an attempt, although I am bordering on speculation here. But I would hazard that Royal Greenland is one entity of many across the country. And the province of Newfoundland has its own responsibilities and authorities with regards to processing capacity and the legislative requirements for foreign investment in that domain. To my understanding, there are no legislated requirements in any province with regards to foreign ownership in the fish processing sector.
Okay, parfait. Mes prochaines questions sont plus...
My next questions are all locally based questions. In my area, we have very lucrative lobster and crab fisheries, and we've seen licenses leave the region. When I'm talking about region, I mean the administrative zone, the Acadian area, and Zone 12. We see licenses are being traded for fantastic amounts of money, $15–20 million, to New Brunswick, to Quebec, Nova Scotia, PEI, or the Madeline Islands. And they do it with great ease because the residency requirement is only 6 months in this area rather than 2 years as in Quebec. So how can we do that? Change the residency requirements for New Brunswick so that it is more or less equal to what we find in other provinces, like Quebec, for example. so that we don't keep losing these quota?
Again, I guess, Mr. Cormier, I'm happy to take an attempt at this one, recognizing that I'm not locally experts and versed in the specific issue. But the residency requirements with regards to the inshore regulations do run into certain challenges with regards to the Charter of Rights and Freedom of Mobility. And as such, we have certain limitations within the department which we can religiously or forcefully enforce that capacity, that residency requirement. There are means by which we can make changes, and I guess we could entertain changes in specific regions or administrative areas of the department, and could pursue that in greater detail with yourself with additional details.
Écoutez, j'aimerais ça vraiment
Thank you, Mr.
comment-
Cormier. There's only 8 seconds left, so it's not time to get in a question or an answer. I see Madame Debienne has joined us online, so I don't know if she'll be asking the questions or for temporary substitution, Madame Berube would be asking questions. So, Madame Debienne, I'll leave it up to you.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Président. J'espère que vous m'entendez.
I hope my sound is coming through clearly. I didn't do the test this morning. Okay, good. I think I'll give the floor to Madame Berube, because she would be better prepared than I am at this point. And she was there at the last meeting, so she knows what's going on.
Yes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm quite pleased to replace my colleague. In April 21 and March 22, DFO sent 174,000 questionnaires in a survey asking for supporting documents. The recipients of this survey, how were they in fact selected, and what was the response rate of this survey?
I might require further clarification as to the exact survey you're identifying, but we did send out a survey to beneficial ownership survey, which was directed to Atlantic offshore, midshore, and exempted fleet license holders, as well as Pacific license holders. So we had scoped out inshore license holders in Atlantic Canada, as well as commercial communal license holders, entities, Aboriginal entities.
Oui, oui, effectivement.
So basically, those individuals were identified then by determining who held those licenses within our databases, and we contacted those license holders to ensure that they were providing information to supplement their ownership information to DFO.
On sait fort bien, Monsieur.
Well, it's well known that there were supplementary information that was requested, 342 respondents, and that no other adjustments were required. Now, further, you sent another 250 surveys for supplementary information or for any revision of arrangements. If we compare 2021 and 2022, can you explain why there's such a difference?
Our discussions in terms of beneficial ownership survey and work that my colleague's been doing on inshore regulations.
Yes, exactly. So thank you for the question. So certainly under the inshore regulations, we do on our website publish the number of questionnaires, as you have referred, that have been sent out to license holders to determine whether they are. It's an examination to ensure that they are eligible to hold an inshore license. And these questionnaires are sent out at time of reissuance. So when there is a request done for a transfer from one license holder to another, we are looking at both license holders' eligibility under the inshore regulations and making a determination. So the statistics that you see on that website, that's the representation of the questionnaires that have been sent out. Depending on the responses received from the department to those questionnaires, we do ask for additional information or clarification. And in some cases, license holders, as you have mentioned, do modify, make modifications, for example, to loan agreements or supply agreements in order to be eligible. The inshore regulations were designed in such a way to bring license holders into compliance with the regulations.
Alors, quelles sont les raisons pour lesquelles
Well, for what reasons? We had 37 restructurings were necessary after the survey in 22.
The revisions to the agreements were done for a variety of reasons. So for those 37, for example, some were related to needing to adjust loan agreements. And this is for things like, for example, having exit clauses in loan agreements. Back to the point where we do not want license holders to be beholden over a long period of time to under those loan agreements. And so that's one example. Another example could be if we're looking for lease agreements to be modified or changed. The whole intent here is to ensure that license holders, yes, there are ways for them to access financing, but it's being done in such a way that they are in control of their business and they have a way to pay down, for example, those loan agreements over a reasonable amount of time.
depuis octobre 2022, combien de questions
Since October 22, how many further requests were made for further information?
So in 2022-2023, we did send out 507 questionnaires. In 238 cases, DFO staff asked for additional information, and in 55 of those cases, one or more existing agreements, they were changed or modified to bring stakeholders, to bring license holders into compliance with the regulations.
Merci.
Thank you.
Et aussi les
What were the differences then in compliance with the regulations by Fisheries in respecting the policy on the preservation of the autonomy of the coastal fisheries in Atlantic area? All in respecting, of course, the regulations inshore.
Of the reasons why license holders may have needed to make modifications. So those 55, for example, I don't have the full breakdown of the reasons why, and certainly we could provide that if there was an interest. But I would suspect it would be similar to what we saw the previous year, which was loan agreements maybe needed to be adjusted or changed, or, for example, to have exit clauses in agreements, or to ensure that there was a reasonable amount of time that those loans were being paid down. And I will say that we are paying attention to ensuring that those loan agreements are in fact being paid down. And that's a big message I would leave you with as well. We don't just receive this information. We are looking to see from the license holders, we are looking to see that those, for example, loan agreements are being paid down and they are being implemented over time.
Est-ce que les accords que vous...
Thank you. Your 6 minutes gone a little bit over. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. First, I'd like to, of course, give my condolences to the loved ones of the harvesters lost in New Brunswick. It's tragic news to hear. I'm going to move on to my questions as there's not a lot of time. And my first question is to Mr. Waddell. Can you clarify, Mr. Waddell, I'm just building off some of the questions that Madame, I believe it's Berube, I'm sorry, I'm not there, started with around the beneficial ownership survey. In an ideal world, can you share with us who should be included in completing that survey in order to receive a comprehensive data set and information for us to be able to move forward around the beneficial ownership on the West Coast?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. So the survey was mandatory for all commercial license holders with, as I indicated previously, the exception of inshore license holders in Atlantic Canada and communal commercial license holders, both of whom, as entities, have their corporate structures regulated pursuant to either the inshore regulations or the Aboriginal communal fishing license regulations. So for Pacific license holders, it would have been all party-based and all vessel-based license holders in Pacific waters.
And so what about those who are working on the boats or those who are not license holders? Are we able to hear from them at all through this survey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As an attempt to get to the beneficial ownership of the license, the requests and the surveys were directed to the license owner.
Thank you. Do we see any issues with that? Could you share with us any issues, please, through the chair, with us only asking the license holders this information and our capacity to understand what's really happening?
Once again, the challenge for us in terms of beneficial ownership is going to the license owner per se. With regards to license leasing as a practice in Pacific fisheries, we do understand that that is a prevalent use and methods by which harvesters avail of access and quota. However, when we were developing the survey and consulting with stakeholders, collectively stakeholders felt that this aspect of the survey design was going to prove too challenging and could be better addressed subsequently. The keen interest from all parties was in deriving a better understanding, a better baseline understanding of foreign ownership, and that meant targeting beneficial ownership structures within Canada's fisheries. I'm not sure if my colleague in Pacific region, Neil Davis, has anything to supplement.
I think I'm going to move on to the next question. Thank you so much. So, Mr. Waddell, perhaps you can clarify your point around can be addressed subsequently. What would that look like?
That would be in discussion and dialogue with harvesters through consultation with them.
Okay. Mr. Riddell, you had also said in a previous question that less than 2%, correct me if I'm wrong, is of the licensing is held by corporate entities. Is that accurate?
The figure was less than 2% is held by foreign entities.
Foreign. Thank you. That's actually what I meant to write down. Yeah. Thank you. Can you clarify how we have that information around that number?
We have that information through the information that's been provided to the department is from license holders through the beneficial ownership survey and in conjunction with the analysis undertaken by the Forensic Accounting Management Group over at Public Services, who are the forensic auditors for the Government of Canada, who've conducted the analysis on our behalf and have done that in 2 tranches of work. Unfortunately, due to the timing of this meeting, I only have results, high-level results for Atlantic Canada. I do not yet have them for Pacific.
Thank you. Again, Mr. Riddell, can you clarify recommendation number 4 in the 2019 report that came out through FOPO is requesting or is a recommendation to increase the transparency of quota licensing ownership and transactions in an easily accessible and readable format, and that this is a public online database that includes, and it goes on to talk about the importance of having accurate public information around the ownership. And I'm wondering if you can clarify if this has been done and how information like this would help us to understand foreign ownership of our licenses.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. On this one, I would turn to my regional colleague who's invested in time in this effort.
Thank you, and I'm happy to offer a bit of information on that. So we have done some work to respond to that particular recommendation. Specifically, in the last year, we contracted somebody with the sort of technical expertise to do an assessment of the information we currently hold and the systems that that information live in to identify what would the requirements be to set up a public registry that would have licensing and quota transactions available and accessible in an easy way, and then to also assess the feasibility, given the requirements of setting that kind of registry up. So that work was completed last year, and we're now shifting to actually creating the necessary sort of work and contracting to complete or construct such a database that would allow us to generate a public registry where those kinds of licensing and transaction and quota transactions could be accessed by the public.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Perkins for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. Mr. Waddell, perhaps as the DG, I guess the guy here, does DFO has a policy that no license holder can have a majority or monopoly on a fishery? Is that correct?
From a corporate concentration policy, is that sort of the thrust of your argument? So corporate concentration is addressed through, on a fishery by fishery basis, often through the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan, within which there will be details as to how much any given license holder can hold in terms of quota. Specific to the inshore fisheries, though, the requirements are that no inshore fisher can hold more than one license per species.
With regard to the offshore, lobster fishing area 41, which is about 3 times the size of Nova Scotia, has 8 licenses, as I understand it. Many years ago, all of the licenses were allowed to be acquired by Clearwater, long before its recent ownership change. Against government policy. My understanding is that government policy was rewritten from the former manager who had to rewrite the policy as all that. Why does DFO allow Clearwater to have a 100% monopoly in lobster fishing area 41?
I'm not able to speculate on the past decision making with regards to that, but specific to that fishery, and my colleague might be able to supplement as well. But my understanding is that the product in question is not in itself a monopoly. There are plenty of lobster fished throughout Atlantic Canada and Quebec, and ergo, this is not necessarily a true monopoly.
Except in that it's a true monopoly because they're the only one allowed in that one area that's 3 times the size of Nova Scotia. No other license holder is allowed in there. So that is a monopoly. You mentioned the percentage of companies that in the beneficial ownership study that had participated that were either Canadian-owned or Canadian headquartered. What's the number that you got in British Columbia from that survey? Do you have an equivalent number?
Unfortunately, at this point in time, I do not have results for Pacific.
So when you say equivalent-owned, they're a Canadian corporation, doesn't mean they're Canadian-owned. The Canadian corporation isn't necessarily, that's the beneficial ownership issue.
Exactly. So we've worked through the beneficial ownership survey and the information that license holders had to provide to the department. And then in conjunction with the forensic accountants at PSPC, we've reviewed that information through the full extent of the corporate chain and determined that 98% of Atlantic licenses are held by Canadian entities.
Thank you. I'll pass the rest of my time to Mr. Arnold.
Thank you to the witnesses for this. I guess for Mr. Waddell, with the legislation and regulations that have been developed and implemented on the East Coast, are there any gaps in assessing, monitoring, enforcement to make sure that the intent of the legislation and regulation to identify beneficial ownership are actually taking place? Are there any gaps?
Would actually turn that one to my colleague, my operational colleague.
Sorry, could you clarify the question, please? Apologies.
With the legislation and regulation on the East Coast that has been implemented, are there any gaps in assessing, monitoring, and enforcing to ensure the intent of beneficial ownership are being implemented?
I would say that in terms of my role, I can't speak to enforcement, but what I can say is that we have implemented a number of measures to ensure that license holders are compliant, essentially with the inshore regulations. On the National Online Licensing website, when harvesters go and pay their fees, they have to declare that they're in compliance with those regulations. And like I said, we are doing spot checks and administrative reviews to ensure that license holders are indeed compliant with those regulations.
Thank you. Ms. Barron started to touch on the survey that went out on the West Coast. We've heard back that the survey actually went out to the wrong people. It went to the license holders, not the people that are actually fishing it. Can you elaborate on why that took place, Mr. Waddell?
The parties that are on record as the owners of the license are those who were contacted.
So not the actual people that were fishing. It was just the owner that was on the license. Now, was that the vessel license or the fishing license?
Both, in terms of we engaged and sought information from both party-based license holders and vessel-based license holders in Pacific.
Okay, thank you. And I believe it's Madam Mooney, it's your responsibility for this national licensing operations and so on. The legislation and regulation has been developed and somewhat implemented on the East Coast. Why never on the West Coast?
I can't speak to that. Perhaps I'll turn it over to you.
I think historically the Pacific fisheries were developed with a different intent and a different methodology was employed, where we introduced as an organization back in the 60s.
Do we not have the same issues now?
Sorry,
developing
Mr.
on the
Arnold,
West Coast?
we're gone over time actually by half a minute. We'll now go to Mr. Callaway for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I too want to send my condolences to the family and to everyone associated with the tragedy on the East Coast with the two fishermen losing their life. And obviously a shout out to Serge Cormier and his constituents as well in respect to that tragedy. So I think one of the things that for those watching at home we need to clearly articulate and identify is that there are two distinct fisheries, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast. And I'm going to just focus on the East Coast for a second. And I'm interested maybe to start with Mr. Waddell and work our way in this room and then perhaps online. Owner-operator was enshrined into law. It is absolutely essential on the East Coast in terms of ensuring that local people operate this industry, that wealth stays in the community for obvious reasons. The spin-offs that emerge from that are really important. So there's a couple of questions. One is, what have we learned in terms of owner-operator on the East Coast, in terms of what is working, what needs to be strengthened on the East Coast, and what can we learn in terms of that application on the West Coast, knowing that there are nuances to that fishery. And I understand there are surveys and there's stakeholder engagement, but I'm interested from a departmental level, what have we learned from the East Coast? What can be strengthened on the East Coast? How can that be applied from a departmental perspective, not to bias any discussions or survey results? What can we learn from both the East Coast, West Coast, and how they can be strengthened on the East Coast and how they can be employed on the West Coast?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I might offer, frankly, is the tremendous value of the perceptions and the information held by license holders in identifying those challenges to DFO. Certainly when we developed the inshore regulations in conjunction with inshore harvesters, their insights into the mechanisms employed within that fishery and the relationships they hold with processing facilities across Atlantic Canada and Quebec was invaluable to the department. And it was through those discussions and consultations which we were able to develop the inshore regulations in a means that sought to meet the joint objectives of both the department and the affected community, the inshore license holders, as well as not overly prescribed limitations that might affect valid business relationships that are established.
Ms. Mooney, do you like to speak to that?
I think to add, obviously, we all recognize the important value and contribution that fishers and inshore fishers play to the Canadian economy and to the Canadian fishing industry. And what I will say is that having looked now so far at about 23% of license holders, an in-depth review of license holders' eligibility under the inshore regulations, I would just say that thanks to the work between license holders and the department, we are seeing a high degree of compliance with those regulations. And I thought that was just important to note.
And anybody on the screen that would want to, Doug Wenzel or my eyes are
Thanks so much for the question, and maybe Mr. Chair, just to build on the comments of my colleagues, I would say that the department certainly benefits from the fact that these measures are in regulation right now. There is clarity around the fact that an inshore license holder needs to benefit from the fishery. They need to participate. They need to make the decisions on that fishery. They need to be on the vessel, those types of things. So it gives us a lot of clarity in terms of being able to ensure compliance. And part of that is ensuring continued education and awareness. That's something that we're going to be continuing to put a priority on, particularly as we see turnover in the fishery with new entrants and licenses changing hands, to ensure that folks understand that this is a regulatory requirement now.
And Neil?
Thanks for the question. In terms of applicability on the West Coast, I think some of the key considerations for us would just be, approaching that, or if we were to explore that, to approach it in the context of the history that has developed with West Coast fisheries. So, for example, in the absence of policies like these for our fisheries, we have agreements that are fairly sort of well established or long standing that may provide access to capital for harvesters for either licenses or quota or other fishing assets. We have examples of where licenses and or quota have been acquired by processors, and there's been, since the introduction of things like quotas, rationalization in fleets where quota has moved between license holders so that they can make their fishing operations viable. And we also would want to take into account some of the elements of the way that I understand the policies have been implemented on the East Coast to consider things like the exemptions that are in place for certain fleets, given some of these kinds of factors, and be clear about the objectives that we're trying to achieve through the introduction of anything like the policies on the East Coast for our fisheries. So given all of that, I think if we were to go down this road, engagement with fishery stakeholders, Indigenous groups that have a significant role in commercial fisheries would be absolutely critical.
Thank you.
For that, we'll now go to Madame Debienne for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Chair. I'd also like to offer my sincere condolences to the harvesters that lost their lives. We've also lost a few firemen during the latest flood in Quebec. Thanks to the witnesses for participating this morning. I have a question on open competition, competition on the Competition Bureau, let's say. When there is a sale or transfer of a license, fishing license, when would the Competition Bureau actually intervene?
With regards to the sale of a license itself, I do not believe that the Competition Bureau would have a significant role. Where we have seen encouragement for the Competition Bureau to turn its attentions is with regards to the sale processing facilities. That said, the Competition Bureau, as an entity of ISED, does have different dollar thresholds and different concentration thresholds that it explores within Canada's industries and determines those as as ISED directs.
Merci de la réponse.
Well, thank you for this answer. Yes, basically it's $1 billion or more transaction that's involved, but do you think that fisheries should be treated and in fact as forestry and other natural resources?
We have in part undertaken the beneficial ownership survey so that we have a factual baseline of information to subsequently have that public policy discussion within Canada's fisheries with affected stakeholders and parliamentarians and others to determine what an appropriate level of foreign ownership may or may not prove to be within Canada's fisheries.
Thank you, Madame Debienne. It's about 14 seconds left, not much time to get a question or an answer. So we'll go to Ms. Barron for 2.5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Chair. My question is for Mr. Riddell. Mr. Riddell, in the next panel, we will be hearing from witnesses from coastal First Nations. And coastal First Nations, as you know, is composed of First Nation territories that cover the vast majority of marine areas in the northern waters of British Columbia. And all these nations have ocean-based fishing families and communities who continue to rely on fish habitat and fisheries in their territories for food security, cultural survival, and economic needs. As you know, these nations along with coastal First Nations signed an agreement, the Fisheries Resources Reconciliation Agreement in 2021. Now, I'm trying to pack a lot of information into a very short question, but ultimately, what I heard from both the coastal First Nations through a letter that was sent to the minister, as well as through other Indigenous fishers through a recent event at the Fishing for Communities, is that corporate and foreign ownership is driving up the prices and resulting in real problems with this agreement and the nation's abilities to be able to meet the needs that the agreement was intended to meet. And I'm wondering if you can share, please, if you've had an opportunity to meet with coastal First Nations and other Indigenous nations to implement a fair, transparent, and collaborative process to ensure that there's a policy in place that works for local communities and for Indigenous nations.
So at this point in time, Mr. Chair, I have not had an opportunity to meet with coastal First Nations other than a brief introduction this morning on the margins of this meeting. That being said, my regional colleague does meet with them on a regular occasion. I would say that this is precisely, Ms. Barron, why we undertook the beneficial ownership survey, so we would have a factual basis on which to make a determination as to the possible extent of foreign ownership.
Thank you, Mr. Riddell. Thank you. Perhaps I will also follow up when they are here. I have just a few seconds left. Can you please share the information that was lacking that you referred to at the beginning of the meeting to effectively assess the concerns that have been put forward? You'd said that there's information lacking. What's one or two things that are missing?
That was the rationale for which we undertook the beneficial ownership survey, because DFO at that point in time did not hold information on the full corporate structure of license holders. So we undertook the survey to gain that information and allow us to make informed policy decisions.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Bragdon for 5 minutes or less, please.
I'm deferring my time back over to Mr. Arnold, I believe.
So kind.
Thank you. I wasn't quite ready here, but I will be.
I can help you.
Again, we'd spoken to the vessel license ownership and the fishing license ownership. Either Ms. Mooney or Mr. Waddell, can you speak to the challenges that the vessels owners are facing when they are forced to pay prices per pound for quota at the beginning of a season, not knowing what the actual sale price will be? How are you working to address that issue that we hear about on the West Coast? You got a question?
If I might, Mr. Chair, I might defer that question to my regional colleague, although that might be one that we would struggle with, admittedly.
Sure, thank you for the question. I think the department's focus on the West Coast has really been about trying to achieve those conservation and economic viability objectives for the fishery. In terms of our sort of role governing what arrangements fishers might make with others who hold quota that they want access to, that has largely been left for them to negotiate arrangements that will work sort of in their best interests. And so I think some of your witnesses later today may have some really interesting insights to that.
Okay, thank you. Perhaps you could also explain why there was such a delayed response to the FOPO report that was tabled in May of 2019. This is now 4 years later in May of 2023, and we're really only hearing just of very preliminary steps in addressing the inability of basically anyone to track down who are the beneficial owners of the licenses and quotas on the West Coast.
We actually have been working quite actively since the committee's report to respond to the recommendations. And I think we were quite explicit from the outset that we saw that happening in a staged way because there were so many recommendations, a number of which were quite complex and complicated to address. And so since the committee's report we have taken immediate steps to respond to some of the recommendations and set ourselves up for engagement on the balance. So for example, we have implemented some new surveys to collect additional socioeconomic data about the fishery that, as my colleague Mark Waddell was alluding to with respect to the beneficial ownership survey, will give us a more informed basis for discussion. We, as I was describing earlier...
Our time is quite limited here. Thank you. Can you table the steps you've taken so far so that the study can have this as part of the study as we move forward to make sure that we're making the best use of our time here? Now, we've heard from harvesters on the West Coast that you started to basically dismantle the existing system by allowing the unmarrying of licenses held by vessel owners, but you did that without putting in place any steps to ensure that those where those licenses were being sold to or to track the actual beneficial ownership. Can you explain why you did that, and have you done anything to change that?
We've made a number of attempts over the years to engage different fleets regarding some of the rules that govern their fisheries. So, marrying, license, stacking, these provisions vary from one fishery to the next, so it matters which fishery we're talking about, and generally have used our engagement and consultation process to implement changes where we have a certain breadth of support for doing so. There are some fisheries where marrying and stacking are a part of the history of the fishery, but we have changed the way we manage the fishery such that those aren't necessarily measures we need to achieve our conservation objectives, and therefore we are open to changing them if they provide the fishery more flexibility. However, if we don't sort of encounter enough support for making those changes, we have generally sort of been reluctant to make changes because they have financial implications for the harvesters that are participating in those fisheries.
Have you reversed any of those processes since we first heard about the unmarrying of licenses and the failure to track beneficial ownership?
I'm not. I think I'd need a bit more specificity to provide you a good answer. But as I said, we would ensure that we were going through the appropriate engagement process to make any sort of policy changes with respect to how we.
Okay, perhaps we'll hear more from the harvesters when they appear. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Morrissey for the remaining 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to follow up on the line of questioning from Mr. Kellaway, because the East Coast, West Coast is two very different dynamics. On the East Coast, under owner-operator, can either Mr. Waddell or Mr. Mooney just clarify who can hold financial security on the license, on an inshore license?
So either a Canadian individual, or a wholly owned company by a Canadian. And there's residency requirements to ensure that those provisions are applicable.
But if I want to go and buy from somebody and I'm the fisher and to arrange financing, one time there was no security allowed on the license, but that was changed under the owner-operator to allow new entrants coming in the fishery to use the license for security for a financial institution. Could you expand on who is legally able to hold security on a inshore fishing license for financing purposes?
So you're correct. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Correct in that registered financial institutions are able to...
Only registered, so only charter banks, credit unions, and government lending agencies can hold security? Why I'm going to, because there would be an issue if we allowed corporate fish processing entities to extend financing to a commercial fisher to acquire their license, because then you're getting into the gray area of controlling where the product goes.
Perhaps I can add, yes. So license holders, they can obtain financing from both registered and non-registered financial institutions. and license holders, there are
Unregistered institution?
Yes, and there are instances where license holders do enter into agreements with processors, for example, for this financing. And so that was done as a way to ensure that license holders have access to capital. And that's one of the reasons why, for example, when we're looking at those loan agreements, we're not just looking at them what's on paper, we're looking to see that those loans, for example, are in fact being paid down.
Those provisions were specifically introduced at the request of the Federation and members of Atlantic Inshore Fishery in order to ensure that they had access to capital and were not limited in that regard.
Okay. Could you provide the committee with the written policy as it relates to who can hold security on a license that is issued by DFO to an inshore fisher? Because I was not aware a processor had the same right to extend credit and hold a license as security as chartered banks, credit unions, and other institutions in it. My second question, time I have left, Mr. Chair, is one of the concerns coming out of the East Coast, but it's one I just want you to clarify, that I don't believe DFO has any control over. It's the growing concentration at the buyer level, the fish processing level, but DFO has no control over the licensing of who is processing seafood in the East Coast. Am I correct?
You are correct.
So that's exclusively a provincial jurisdiction for the monitoring of who is gaining control and who has ownership of all the processing capacity in the East Coast?
Correct. Fish and seafood licensing processing facilities are licensed by the provinces, and each province has its own respective legislation in that regard.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Morrissey. That concludes our first hour of committee business today. I want to thank the witnesses from the department for coming today and answering such valuable questions and providing such wonderful answers. I'm sure it'll be make a great part of our study at the end of the day. So again, we'll suspend for a moment while we switch out for the next panel. I'd like to welcome our second panel of witnesses. Representing the BC Seafood Alliance, we have Christina Burridge, Executive Director by video conference. And representing the Fish, Food and Allied Workers Union of Newfoundland and Labrador, we have Mr. Greg Pretty, President by video conference as well. And representing Coastal First Nations Great Beer Initiative, we have Paul Correa, Senior Policy Advisor, and we have Christine Martin, she's not there, okay. So we have Paul Correa. Used to be a hockey player named at one time, wasn't it, in the NHL? Anyway, thank you for taking the time to appear today. You will each have up to 5 minutes for an opening statement, and we'll start off with Ms. Burridge, please.
Good morning from Vancouver, everyone. So I'm here for the BC Seafood Alliance, and that's an umbrella organization whose 30 members represent fisheries accounting for about 90% of the value of wild seafood from Canada's Pacific coast. Our members are commercial harvester associations and most major seafood processors. I want to make 4 points. First, foreign investment or corporate concentration is not challenging the success of West Coast fisheries. Reduced access is the main impediment. Second, DFO's beneficial ownership study should tell us if there is an issue with foreign investment in BC fisheries, and really I don't expect that there will be much of one. 3, most harvesters in BC are incorporated for the same reason as other businesses. And lastly, quota reallocations under the Canadian Integrated Groundfish Program happen daily and are necessary for the efficient, sustainable use of the resource. So to go to those points on access, the Northern Shelf Bioregion MPA network will reduce access for key species by 25 to 45%, despite 25% of BC's waters already being protected, and that percentage should rise to 35% by the end of 2023. So it's this that is driving harvesters out of business, not licensing policy. On ownership, we want to see discouraging speculation, not investment. We've proposed ways to do this, like a license and quota registry, as well as a shared risks and benefits policy to ensure predetermined percentage returns to quota holders, vessels, and crews so that the lessor is not saddled with the risk. On foreign investment, 2 of my processing members have foreign owners. They are solid Canadian operations who have invested in communities like Ucluelet and Port Edward when no other domestic operator was prepared to do so. Where they own licenses, those Canadian companies do so to ensure the plant has access to fish that provides jobs for Canadians and revenue to local communities. On corporate concentration, the oft-asserted view that BC is a corporate fleet misses the point. Most fishermen are incorporated for the same reasons as other business people, so that's liability protection, business planning, and to provide for essential capital investment. Most vessel-based licenses are owned by 2 or more parties who operate as a joint venture. There are dozens of variations on these arrangements, often between a processor and an operator or operators. These arrangements encourage the kind of cooperation that Report for Agriculture Canada says is essential to improved prosperity in Atlantic fisheries. We benefit from a diverse fleet and a diverse range of processing companies. For instance, before the halibut fleet went to ITQs in 1991, only large corporations had the capacity to process the volume and purchased approximately 3/4 of the landed catch. Now that harvesting takes place over 9 months rather than 6 days, processing is dominated by small specialist processors who deliver a high-quality, high-value product. Furthermore, Canadian Fishing Company does not own everything. It owns 30% of roe herring licenses, 12% of roe herring gillnet licenses, 4% of salmon licenses, 21% of groundfish trawl quota, 15% of Pacific hake quota, 3% of halibut, 2% of sablefish, and no shellfish quota at all. On quota reallocations in brownfish, the integrated program integrates management of some 66 different stocks, 7 fisheries, and 3 gear types, and accounts for about 2/3 of all BC landings. So this program requires full accountability for every fish caught, whether retained or discarded. Temporary reallocations cover bycatch and allow for full utilization within science-informed catch limits. These reallocations require DFO approvals and various checks and balances, such as a 1% on halibut quota or species caps and holding caps for trawl. So I just leave you with the message that good policy comes from good data, and I urge you to base your recommendations on facts, analysis, and evidence rather than anecdotal information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Burridge. Just a reminder to witnesses, if they're giving a statement, don't put your hand over the mic because it makes it a little bit muffled and the translators can't get it fully. So just want to make that note of that. We'll now go to Mr. Correa for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and you've got the lesser Paul Correa, although we're proud of him and thrilled of him as a hockey player and what he accomplished. I'm just only slightly less well-known than him. Thank you to the committee. Thank you to other witnesses, to my good friend Christina. I know we probably are going to disagree on more things than agree this time around, but she is a good friend and colleague. I also want to say that my friend, colleague, and boss, Christine Smith-Martin, is ill this morning. She is here in Ottawa in her hotel room and asked me to give these remarks, which are hers, to the committee. I also want to acknowledge the First Nations of the Algonquin and the Anishinaabe, the local peoples whose traditional territories we're meeting on. And also, as was mentioned earlier, the loss of life of fishermen on the East Coast, but also there's been a loss of life amongst West Coast fishermen. 2 Haida fishermen passed away fishing in Skidegate Inlet 3 days ago, so I want to mention that. I'm Paul Correa. I work as a Senior Policy Advisor for the Great Bear Initiative Society, also known as Coastal First Nations. Our organization has been together for about 20 years and has had great success in working together with the federal and provincial government on key land and marine policy issues. The Haida Nation, the Metlakatla First Nation, the Gitsala Nation, the Gitgat First Nation, the Kitasoo Hayhays Nation, the Heiltsuk First Nation, the Newhalk Nation, a Nuakino Nation, whose territories include over 40% of the marine waters and coastline in British Columbia, are member nations of the Great Bear Initiative Coastal First Nations organization. While a vast geography, the region has a relatively sparse population. Approximately 23,000 people live here, with close to 50% being First Nations peoples. Yet, we currently hold less than 6% of the commercial fishing access in the region. For all of our communities, fishing has been integral to our economies. However, licensing regimes have led to the conglomeration of licenses into investor and corporate hands without regard to coastal people. Most of our Coastal First Nation members and communities have limited economic opportunities other than fisheries. This coastal region does not have the advantage of a diverse economic opportunities, services, or amenities enjoyed in urban settings. Given the remoteness of the communities, fish are fundamental to First Nations as a source of economic, cultural, and social well-being. As such, meaningful economic development for First Nations in this region must include restoring our access to fisheries as a foundation of our local economies. Coastal First Nation members have a long history of success in the commercial fishing sector. However, the participation of First Nation fishers was significantly reduced in recent decades due to fleet rationalization initiatives, which disproportionately affected Indigenous fish harvesters, as well as ongoing corporate concentration of licenses and the depletion of marine resources. In general, coastal communities have become increasingly disenfranchised from the resources that originally built them. Our nations, together with the Great Bear Initiative Society, signed a transformative fisheries resource reconciliation agreement, the FRRA, in July 2021, which commits Canada and our nations to the collaborative governance and management of fisheries, fish habitat, and fisheries, including financial support for increased access to commercial fishing licenses and quota for the nations. One of the key objectives of the FRRA is to create conditions where First Nation members can participate fully in the fisheries economy that is foundational to their past and future. Significant funds were provided by Canada to the nations through the agreement to support increased commercial fishing opportunities. However, this access is based on a willing seller, willing buyer transaction where we must buy all the licenses and quota from the marketplace and compete with every other interested party. It is well documented that for many commercial fishing licenses and quota categories, long-standing corporate and investor concentration combined with growing offshore ownership and investment of BC licenses and quota have and continue to drive up prices. Many species fished in BC have license and quota values that far exceed any reasonable return on investment for an independent fisher or a small fishing company. A direct example is from one of our commercial fishing enterprises who recently was pursuing the purchase of a high-value dive fishing license in BC for a high-value product sold in Asia. A broker had a license available for sale, and a reasonable offer was made by the CFE based on fair market valuation at the time. The broker mentioned not to bother making another offer as they had a blank check from an offshore buyer who were already offering 25% more than the current market value.
I have to interrupt you there, Mr. Correa. We're going over time, and I will note that the members will be circulated a copy of your statement. So we'll go to questions now for the members. We'll go to Mr. Arnold for 6 minutes. Wait. Oh, I forgot Mr. Pretty, homeboy, all the way from Newfoundland by camera. What technology we have today. So, Mr. Pretty, 5 minutes or less, please. You're on mute, Mr. Pretty.
Well, I hope I didn't lose my time for that.
No, that forgives me for not getting to you.
I'll take an extra minute. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, on behalf of the 13,000 members of our union, thanks for the opportunity to address the honourable members today. We, the FFAW, represents every single harvester in this province, encompassing about 3,000 owner-operator enterprises, and there are over 7,000 crew members. Our scope of membership also includes thousands of workers in fish processing plants, aquaculture, marine transportation, hospitality, and other sectors. In this province, the value of the inshore fishery cannot be underestimated. It is our oldest industry, closely connected to our culture, and continues to give economic stability and opportunity to coastal communities. Throughout our rich history, hardworking Newfoundlanders and Labradorians have devoted their lives and livelihoods to the ocean around us, and this dedication continues to be the backbone of the province, supporting a $1 billion industry each year that continues to grow and present new opportunities. Today, our collective success depends on keeping the value of this industry in capable hands, not just for Newfoundland and Labrador, but for all of Canada. It's been acknowledged time and again that preserving our foundation, the foundation of an owner-operator fishery, is crucial to the economic sustainability of coastal communities. However, we have experienced increasing foreign control of the processing and corporation sectors. Major control of our fishery being given to foreign governments not only has negative impacts on fishing licenses and quotas, but also creates significant barriers to new entrants, thereby suppressing succession planning for the industry. Increasing corporate control has very negative repercussions. It has depressed wharf competition, stifled the ability of harvesters to seek new buyers, and forced labor relations into a binding arbitration system tilted severely in the favor of processors. For years, our members have had to fight and act against companies who attempt to dictate the terms of the inshore fishery and actually coordinate efforts not to buy landings. Can you believe that in 2023 we're still fighting that battle? I've heard the references to Royal Greenland. I won't go in great detail. Hopefully, I'll just get through what I have to say. But the interests of harvesters and plant workers in Greenland compete with the interests of harvesters and plant workers in Newfoundland. That doesn't make any sense, but it happens. Who do you think gets the smallest share? Royal Greenland will purchase seafood wherever has the best or the greatest benefit for Greenland. In 2020, it showed no interest in buying Newfoundland and Labrador shrimp, thumbed its nose at collective bargaining, and then locked out harvesters for most of the shrimp season. They deliberately avoided competition by agreeing to serve only certain territories or customers and knowingly restricting production and supply. That's considered cartel-like behavior, as some people have referenced already today. Cartel-like behavior by the Competition Bureau's own definition. Royal Greenland secures conditions to control all aspects of the fishery, including ensuring subsidiaries have privileged access to quotas or landings, despite such practices not being permitted in the inshore fishery. However, to circumvent Newfoundland or Canadian federal regulations, Royal Greenland has created its own form of vertical integration through the acquisition of contracts that place them illegally in control of harvester licenses. And I think that's the key of my messaging today. Corporate concentration has inflated the cost of licenses, and in many cases, an inshore harvester does not have access to that level of capital, already discussed earlier today. A processor needs to secure a supply of raw materials so that the processor pays for a license in the name of the inshore harvester, thereby owning the license and hiding behind the name of that harvester. The processor then controls when the license is fished, who fishes it, which boat is used, and how much the harvester is paid. I want to jump on to the next aspect of this because the federal government has made progress to strengthen owner-operator and fleet separation policies. That's been done, enshrining the owner-operator policy into law in 2021. That was celebrated right across this industry as it set out to protect the value of fisheries by ensuring that it remains in local communities. However, as a regulatory body, DFO has proven to be unequipped to enforce this policy. DFO has yet to move forward with any penalty for the over 30 files that they've investigated since the policy became enshrined in 2021. Instead, the reaction has to be to gently guide corporations back to compliance. That's not working. And if you're watching what's going on in Newfoundland and Labrador today, we've had 3 fisheries come to a complete halt because of, one of markets, but other corporate concentration, which is really out of control. Much of the significant disappointment of independent harvesters across Canada, the owner-operator policy has proven to be nothing more than a workshopping exercise for DFO without any deterrence or consequences for violations. A message from the department expressing a commitment to protect owner-operator fisheries is now critical to restore confidence in this legislation. As Canadians, as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, will the future of our fishery be vibrant and sustainable, composed of thousands of small businesses in the water that continue to contribute to the rich fabric of culture in our country's economy? Or will it be controlled by a small handful of processed offshore or internationally companies and remove the wealth from our sustainable resources from the adjacent communities that depend on them to serve another country's bottom line? It is incumbent on every member here and all Canadians who value our oceans to protect this public resource and to ensure it is the people of Canada who enjoy the economic and societal benefits that come from our waters. I appreciate the attention given to the gravity of the situation by the committee members, and I look forward to answering any questions to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Priddy. We'll now go to our rounds of questioning that I tried to go to before you spoke by accident. But we'll go to Mr. Arnold now for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, we'll recognize the harvesters, fishermen that were lost on both coasts over recent days. It's a tragic and sometimes very dangerous profession and want to recognize the efforts that they put in and the first responders and search and rescue people that put in as well. I'll start off with a couple of quick questions for Ms. Burridge, if I could. Ms. Burridge, in your opening remarks, you said that part of your statement under corporate concentration was that most vessel-based licenses are owned by two or more parties who operate a joint venture. There are dozens of variations on these agreements, often between a processor and an operator or operators. These arrangements encourage the kind of cooperations that a report for Agriculture Canada says is essential to improved prosperity in Atlantic fisheries. Would you be able to forward that report to the committee? I don't believe I've seen it, and I'm not sure if other FOPO members have here. And
Ms. Burridge, could I ask you to lower the boom on your mic, please, because it's way up too high. Okay, maybe lift it up a little bit from where you got it now. There you go. Okay, we'll hear you that much better.
Thank you. Now, also in your opening statement, you talked about ownership and talked about discouraging speculation over investment. Briefly, if you could you provide what a beneficial ownership policy would look like if that's not what we have now?
Well, I think we have to go back to what Mr. Waddell said. We actually need some information about the extent and the nature of foreign ownership so that we can decide whether we have an issue here. And if we have an issue, what's the problem that we want to solve and what are the mechanics for solving it?
Thank you.
We don't know any of that at the moment.
You don't know what it would look like. Is that what you said?
Well, I don't think we know where the beneficial ownership of licenses on this coast lies, and I think that is the first step in any process.
Okay, and what's the biggest impediment to knowing where those beneficial ownerships lie?
Well, first of all, DFO didn't have any data until they embarked on the survey, and secondly, I was very pleased to hear from Mr. Davis that it appears that DFO is going to move towards a public license and quota registry.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn my question now to Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa, thank you for speaking, and I listened to you speak at the Fisheries for Communities conference a couple of months ago in Victoria. I was very encouraged to hear what you said. The reconciliation and was it the FRRA agreement that you spoke about? Could you elaborate a little further on the actual title? I don't think I captured it quite correctly, and what the purpose of that agreement is.
Thank you for the question. The FRRA is a major reconciliation agreement negotiated by the 8 First Nations who are our members and the Government of Canada. It has 3 broad objectives. One is to restore participation in the open commercial fishery rules of DFO of our member nations. The second one is to restore an artisanal fleet and fishing for food, which nation would be able to sell if they chose to. So that artifice that has put a lot of people in jail for no reason through the years will disappear. But the fish will have to be counted, securely processed, and all of that. So there's a big commercial fishery, a small fishery for food security and that, and there will be some incidental sale. The third big component of that agreement is co-management. Now, there's been co-management and co-management agreements, but this will be, it'll take some time. I think we have between DFO and us, a schedule of how it'll be implemented. But for all of the species that have, we heard the term earlier, an integrated fish management plan, an IFMP, those will be jointly developed between our nations and DFO. Right now, it's the minister who signs off and approves. Going forward in the future, it'll be both the First Nations for our areas and the minister.
Okay, thank you. Is that agreement open to the public, or are we allowed or able to see that agreement as FOPO members?
Yes, the main agreement is obviously a public document. There are, I'll just say up front, there are schedules and annexes that have financial components that are business confidential.
Thank you. Now, you spoke about a dive fishing license. I'm guessing that might have been geoduck from things I've heard, and that it basically became unavailable to a license or a local operator because of a bid by foreign entities. Are you aware of other cases where we see licenses or quota being bought up on the West Coast by non-Canadians, basically?
Yes, yes. The actual example, and I'm careful in how I say it because our nations are still trying to work in the marketplace, and it's a fairly small world out there. The actual example was sea cucumber, but there are other examples, and they include geoduck.
Okay. Are there efforts by processors to influence who owns licenses and quotas on the West Coast as well?
Yes, I believe so. Now, I'm hesitant only because I haven't heard the actual case situations, but from past experience, and I say past experience, I say yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arnold. We'll now go to Mr. Hardy for 6 minutes or less.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and want to appreciate the attendance of our witnesses today. In 2019, we tabled that report, the sharing of risks and benefits, and certainly the fatalities that we've noted on the east and west coasts underscores the risks that harvesters face in return for benefits that just don't measure up from every indication that we've had. My first question is for Ms. Burridge. Is it fair to say that the corporate ownership of processing is really, the two dominant companies are Canfisco and Jim Pattison Industries? Is that right?
Canfisco is part of Jim Pattison Enterprises.
And of course, Canfisco is owned by Jim Pattison.
Yes.
Some statistics here. Canfisco is recorded as owning 243 licenses at $25.4 million in value. Pattison, 135 licenses at $22.9 million in value. The next one on the list of top owners is Elma K, 18 licenses at $8.2 million. Does that not suggest a problem of concentration of ownership, Ms. Burridge?
Mr. Hardy, I gave you the number of licenses owned by Canfisco and Jim Pattison Enterprises. I think that speaks for itself, that they are not the dominant force. If anything, they're probably trying to divest their interests in British Columbia.
I'd like to see some evidence of that.
I think you will.
When we look at incomes, and this will be for Mr. Correa, the statistics are interesting. They reveal a little bit, but they hide some vital information. Overall, when it gets to the retail sector of the BC fishery, retail between restaurants, food stores, etc., it's worth about $1.5 billion. At the wholesale level, it's about $850 million. And the landed value to fishers is $400 million. This is what we hear, but that's the gross. I would suggest that particularly where the harvesters are concerned, that $400 million, when you net out what they're paying to get the right to fish, it's an awful lot less.
I'd agree with you, Mr. Hardy.
Before you start, Mr. Correa, I'd ask Ms. Burridge to lower the boom on the mic on the headset just a little lower so as we can get proper translation. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Correa, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would agree with you, Mr. Hardy. There are, I think we all know that there are examples of fishermen who hold and own their own licenses and fish them, and if we compare their kind of returns to those who are indentured to holders and owners of quota and licenses, there is no comparison. One is barely eking out a living, maybe not eking out a living, where one is doing quite well. And so hence the owner-operator model, something that we've been pushing forward, owner-operator and First Nations, is because we can see it working, but that's unfortunately not what's happening right now.
You mentioned the competition for that sea cucumber license, and that the foreign purchaser came in with a lot more money than anybody locally could offer. Do you suspect that foreign interests are actually overpaying for access to either quota or licenses? I mean, are they basically throwing around a lot of money for whatever reason?
Yeah, I mean, I hear all sides of the argument, and some would say to me, Paul, it's the marketplace. And so if someone has excess money to throw around, it's their business. It's part of the market. So how do you peg what is a reasonable return or what is reasonable in what has been a more stable market? And one might argue about that too from the past. But it appears that there's something that's really gone out of whack with folks who are putting up money that does not reflect any recent or past trends. They're prepared to suck it all up.
It surprise you to know that the recent Cullen Commission on Money Laundering in BC paid some attention to the ownership of license and quotas based on the fact that people wanting to launder money or hide money in North America were prepared to pay 30% or more over market value just as a place to land their dollars in Canada.
It was shocking and stunning and disappointing to have excessive housing, real estate monies, fancy cars and that, and fish lumped in with that in that money laundering investigation. Absolutely.
So we know, and we've heard pretty graphic testimony in any number of hearings of the marked difference between the East Coast fishery and the West Coast fishery. They evolve differently. Looking back in time, as you can, Mr. Correa, was there a reason for the way things were done in British Columbia, and as we look to what is a clear desire to move to an owner-operator type regime for British Columbia, is there anything in what we've developed in BC over the years that's worth keeping?
That's a hard one to respond to, Mr. Hardy. I grew up in the commercial fishery. To the chair's question about Paul Correa, I'm proud when I give public talks in other spheres to say that there was a boy in the NHL whose grandfather came to Canada to fish. I remember as a boy when the first Davis Plan came in and my father as a fisherman thinking through his options of an A license versus a B. And then as herring and that went on, and Christina can recount some of this too from her time. So what to keep and what to throw away requires some thoughtful, complex thinking. I think that First Nations have suffered by being excluded from when the commercial licensing regime came in. That must be rectified, and I think that's what the reconciliation agreement stands for. But I think beyond that, there's so much more, and again, this committee probably isn't the place to get into what's wrong with how resources have been managed in our province to the detriment of First Nations who I work for today. So I don't want to give a glib answer and say throw it all out or get into it without further understanding of it, but there is lots that needs to be changed, I suspect. We haven't gotten into restoration of fish and fisheries. We haven't gotten into the overall management. Christina, in her opening comments, gave a comment about the northern region, bioregion, the Marine Protected Areas network that we're working on. I want to say that it's not just accessing fish to sell to make money that our nations are concerned about. They're thinking about all of our long-term futures in terms of how the resource, and it's not just the resource, but the habitat are managed. That's what the MPA network is about, and that's what Canada is proud about in terms of the world stage. Is there a way to do this with fishermen, all fishermen? Yes, of course. And so I just want to make the statement.
I'm going to have to end it here, Mr. Correa. We're going to go a bit over time. We'll go to Madame Debienne now for 6 minutes or less, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. My question is addressed to Mr. Purdy. You spoke of a cartel, a monopoly, and DFO said no, they didn't discover any monopolies through their survey. Do you think a survey is the best way to get this kind of information of foreign ownership?
No. The quick answer is no. We need a declaration. I think we need to restate what the policies are here, and we need some direct intervention on these companies. Nobody's been charged. Not that there would be charges, but there could be. There could be charges. There could be legal issues here that have been contravened and need to be addressed. And until that's done, what you'll see is what I heard earlier today, is that these thinly veiled financial deals between harvesters and companies, whether it be Canadian or foreign, obfuscate the actual intent. And that is, as we know, is to hold control of those licenses. And if you have a declaration as nothing has happened in 2 years, we need to get at the issue here. Because, my friends, there are cartel-like activities. And when harvesters come to me and say, you know, this should be investigated by the Competitions Bureau, because what's happening here, you know, they all have the same price. They treat harvesters like the reference today, hockey players. They own them, they can trade them, they can sell them. That's not what we bought into with the Canadian harvesting licenses. So we need to get back to that. I know that's long-winded, but thank you for that question.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much. I think that was a very enlightening answer. Now, Royal Greenland, for example, among others, of course, in Quebec, we also living through the same type of experience. Manipulation, shall we say? It gives a lot of power in the hands of the processors. What solution might you recommend to the committee in order to, in fact, avoid that one has to go through the processor in order to get their license and make it profitable?
And I'll respond.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, you need a permit, a license from the province to act as poorly as one does. Without that provincial license, you can't manipulate, you can't obfuscate, and you can't control. So the initial fix to this is making sure that you have a licensing policy that actually is conducive to an orderly fishery. And I've said this many times since I became president in the last 4 months. You can't have a provincially issued processing license, give it to some company, entity, and they can systematically then take apart the fishery, take apart the town's finances. And that's what we're seeing here. So the initial fix is with the province, but you cannot have controlling licenses that will eventually, as you are now seeing in BC, that are controlling not only the licenses but the quotas. And when that happens, then you cannot negotiate a proper price, market-wise or otherwise, with harvesters. And the control slowly shifts to these the foreign controlled interests and Canadian outside provinces issues. So that's the first step. Some of these companies have very good ideas for marketing. I understand that. We deal with that. But they have to stay in their own lane. And they have to process, but they can't interfere with the owner-operator. And, you know, if it's jail to send a message out for some of these cats, then that's what has to happen to fix this issue. So I thank you again for the question.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. I'd like to continue a few more questions, Mr. Perry. Am I coming through? Yes? Okay. Once the provinces have actually issued a license in the normal course of affairs, what would be the next steps to be taken in order to have a better monitoring or surveillance of this interference, if you will, into the fisher licenses. And we have to resolve it with something more than just a survey. What would be the ideal mechanism or tool?
I mean, surveys are pretty ineffectual in dealing with a situation like this. But if you look at if you go back to the provincial issue, provincially licensed issue, if you have a provincial license, there has to be consequences. First of all, you have to have a plan. What are you going to do with that provincial license? You're going to do multi-species. You're going to employ X number of people, and you're going to get into the marketplace. And there's going to be a benefit to the province for the issue of the licenses. So there has, and once that's done, part of that process is to ensure, as an extra standard here, that they don't engage as a conditional provincial license. They don't engage in controlling license issues. That can also be, stiffened or supported through the federal regulations on individual licenses. So that's all we see as a start to having a better way of business to ensure that the owner operator survives in this province.
Thank you, Mr. Pretty. Thank you, Madam Debian. We'll now go to Ms. Barron for 6 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Correa, it was great to hear from you and to see you along with my colleagues, Mr. Hardy and Mr. Arnold, at the Fishing for Communities conference that we recently attended. And thank you for your testimony so far today. I'm wondering if you can expand a little bit around, we have heard increasingly, you also spoke around First Nations being increasingly disenfranchised and alienated from the fisheries and all species within fisheries, which are essential to coastal First Nation communities in British Columbia. And I'm wondering if you can expand on, in order to move forward with true reconciliation, what needs to happen to increase access for First Nations to all species on Canada's west coast?
Thank you, Ms. Barron. The Reconciliation Agreement wants to put First Nations people back on the water. From that area north of Vancouver Island to the Alaska Panhandle, the areas of the 8 nations that I work for. So we need a transfer mechanism of the licenses and quotas that are being held. What was negotiated with the Government of Canada was to use the marketplace. There could have been other tools used. The Government of Canada could have expropriated and compensated and then turned over under agreement access to species. That's at the heart of the matter here, and why I'm appearing is because the market isn't working. That the settlement funds that we've received to utilize to go into the marketplace would be chasing silly money, and it wouldn't have the buying power. We want to see that changed, and the owner-operator approach that we've heard of from the East Coast, we believe could do that. And so the goal is to get First Nations people fishing again. All of the communities that I work for used to have a small boat fleet. None of them do now. Children, teenagers, and that access the water through a water taxi, or they dangle their feet off a dock. They're not on platforms that used to fish, and that's what we want to restore. Families having that opportunity to fish again, as well as a fleet that would go ocean-wide and participate, probably at a lighter footprint in terms of impact than has been managed under DFO.
Thank you very much. I'll continue on with questions to you through the chair. We heard about those implications on First Nations communities and coastal communities that you're talking about. And could you expand a little bit around, you'd mentioned the willing seller and willing buyer approach. Can you expand as to why this market mechanism is not working for First Nations to be able to fully participate in fisheries and coastal communities in British Columbia?
Our colleague from the union on the Atlantic talked about cartels. There are cartels working, I believe, in British Columbia. There are certain species that are held by a limited number of entities, and I think they've probably banded together to work against us, saying this is the thin edge. We don't want to give up our access, and we'll work together on pricing in that. There is in the agreement that we have with Canada a review, and in that review, when we negotiated with the past minister, we said we would come back, and if indeed the market wasn't working, we would want to say to the Government of Canada, you can take your money back, and it's up to you, Minister and Government, to do the expropriation and taking back, and then compensating if you wish to. So those are options in our toolkit to make this reconciliation agreement work. The market is not working as a market where there is a free trade back and forth with money to be used. That's the money we have. We have made some purchases, but very little in the 18 months of operation, 2 years since the agreement was signed. And we're fearful that using this money, again, on behalf, we have a separate fishing corporation that we've incorporated with a new CEO, a separate board of directors, but they're experts in fishing, and they're advising, let's not engage in this. We're just perpetuating what's gone on. We must see fundamental change, and the market may not deliver that.
Thank you. Mr. Korea, I will continue on. What are the environmental and ecological impacts that are being seen by coastal First Nations as a result of large corporations and foreign entities having disproportionate access to BC's fisheries?
Yeah, it could be a long answer. I'll maybe give a short one in saying there are certain techniques and types of fishing that I think through science has been invoked earlier, we've learned can be harmful to the bottom. So for example, bottom trawling can be harmful. Maybe in other areas it's seen as not harmful, but in certain sensitive areas in that. And I think under our involvement in management, we'd like to see the elimination of that type of fishing technique, particularly in many areas. And some of them maybe can be adapted in certain ways, but let's do that together. I think the outreach from the nations is to work with the Government of Canada and other harvesters in that and saying, can we do this in a way that sustains the future in terms of fisheries in a more integrated way rather than species by species, but on an environmental basis?
Thank you, Ms. Barron. We'll now go to Mr. Small for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is to Mr. Pretty. Mr. Pretty, it was nearly impossible to source harvesters to testify at this study, either publicly or anonymously. What do they have to fear, especially what's termed in Newfoundland as independent harvesters? What are they fearing, Mr. Pretty?
You're on mute.
Okay, thanks for the question. First of all, for everybody's benefit, it's not everybody. There are numbers of harvesters that obviously would not participate in that for fairly obvious reasons, is that there could be repercussions from the company if in fact they spoke out against the process. I think that would be perhaps the primary issue here. The other issue is that while the companies spend a lot of time saying this really is not an issue, it's simply a financial issue that we're supplying pots or gear to harvesters, then lots of people know the difference based on the cost of these licenses, which, as somebody has already said, can be very significant. So there are a number of reasons. I just outlined a couple why people wouldn't want to go public and signify that they're a part of that process. I understand that, by the way.
Again, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Pretty, is the current shutdown of the crab and shrimp fishery linked in any way to corporate control in the fishery in Newfoundland and Labrador, in your opinion, Mr. Pretty?
Well, yes, I have an opinion, thank you, and It was absolutely remarkable that we had a tie-up on the crab fishery. Just to put that in perspective, last year was about $850 million fishery. This year it stopped, and the other things that stopped with it were lobster. And by the way, lobster was settled through a formula, so there's no secrets or surprises. It's either up or down. And the lobster fishery was stopped actually twice in the last 2 weeks, and the shrimp fishery is stopped. And people even refused, our processors even refused to buy whelk and halibut. So I've been around long enough, Mr. Small, to know that my considered opinion is that is corporate related, and that is cartel-like behavior when the entire industry can close based on a crab fishery. But they're trying to teach us a lesson here. And they do that every now and then, but we'll be eventually we'll be successful in getting these things up and going. Thanks for that.
Thank you, Mr. Preddy. So you basically said that processing companies are acting in unison. If one or more buyers broke with the group, have you heard talk of any penalties that would be assessed amongst the group, which you refer to cartel-like activities? Have you heard anything about any penalties between these folks?
None, sir. I will say, as a point of clarification, that crab fishery in particular has approximately 10 or 12 companies, and it runs from a very small family businesses that have been ongoing for 30 years up to Royal Greenland. And with very deep pockets. So that's the complexion of these processing companies, and no penalties. Zero.
So again, Mr. Chair, to Mr. Preddy, do smaller fish processing companies rely on larger companies to market their products? And if so, would a federal marketing program help smaller processing companies and open up a little competition and reduce these effects?
Not all companies rely on larger companies. Some of these smaller companies have long established relationships in both Asia and the United States. And some of those relationships go back over 30 years. I do acknowledge that some companies do use OCI and Royal Greenland for marketing purposes. There's no question about that.
Thank you, Mr. Small. We'll close out now with Mr. Henley.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all witnesses for this morning. Ms. Burge, I'd like to start with you. You talk about, in your opening comments, actually, that foreign ownership is not so much the issue, but reduced access is the main impediment. I wonder if you could elaborate on what impediments to access there are, briefly.
Okay, so over the last 3 decades or so, we've seen across the board a decline in harvest volume of more than a third for all 4 species categories. That's for a range of reasons, from conservation to changing markets. So, and it's been particularly extreme in the north with salmon and herring, where you've seen an 80% decline in both volume and value. And clearly, if you have less fish, you will have not as many fish harvesters. And so what we're seeing in many respects is a result in that decline in volume. Initiatives like the Northern Shelf bioregion MPA network will only add to that, with massive loss of access in sustainable fisheries. And that will reduce investment. It will reduce the shoreside support services for Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities alike.
Thank you. And so I'm trying to tease out some of the reasons that you have clearly quite a different perspective from Mr. Correa and the Coastal First Nations. I'm wondering when you talk about using evidence rather than anecdotal information, always a good idea, although sometimes anecdotal information can help to inform evidence. But what is there? Can you point out some anecdotal information you have heard that you would dispute, maybe specifically?
Well, I want to see the results of the DFO beneficial ownership survey. We've strongly supported that, in part because we believe that foreign ownership, for instance, is not as prevalent as many have suggested. And where it is, it's with long-standing investments. I think, too, that we need ways that fisheries can work amongst themselves to come up with effective solutions, and that includes ways to look at sharing the benefits in a more fair way. We've seen that happen with some fisheries. I don't think owner-operator is going to solve any of the problems that we've looked at today.
So are you aware of West Coast, East Coast differences in policy and regulation? And I mean, I'm sure you are, but do you think that the existing regulatory climate, in your opinion, is appropriate to the West Coast?
I think that, as everyone has acknowledged, the two coasts have developed very differently. Changes in licensing policy on this coast have been driven by conservation requirements, as I think one of the DFO speakers alluded to. I think that at the same time, DFO has not always considered the socioeconomic implications of those conservation measures, and we're always open to discussing ways to fix those on a fishery-by-fishery basis.
Thank you. In my remaining time, Mr. Correa, you didn't get a chance to go through your report, and I noticed 3 key recommendations near the end of your report, which have been addressed to some extent in our subsequent testimony. But could you maybe quickly review and elaborate on your three recommendations to address the deficiencies in regulation?
Thank you for the question. I want to acknowledge the report that was done by the committee, a good report in 2019, and to the questions asked earlier about the slow pace of response from DFO. And so you're right, we echo the recommendations that came out of the report, a good report. We've got to reduce the impact of non-Canadian money. I think there is it anecdotal? There is some evidence. I think the German report that Mr. Hardy referenced on money laundering is some actual examples of non-Canadian monies being utilized to impact quotas and licenses. That has to stop. I think the lack of transparency in the beneficial ownership of quota and licenses is not new, but that too has to change. And I think no one is saying it will be easy, but ducking it won't solve it. And I suspect that a little bit of the DFO response is ducking it. We've got to get to it. So let's get on with it. And from a First Nation point of view, I think our chiefs and leaders have had some impact at the negotiating table with Canada and with British Columbia, but that kind of engagement has to continue. There needs to be transition plans. I think some of the members that Christina represents are fearful of change to come, and I think our organizations, the people I work for, want to work with Christina's people. The Marine Protected Areas Network that Christina mentioned again has had an active involvement from some of her membership, and we invite them. And in fact, some of them have pulled away. Now, they may not be happy, and we can understand some of the change to come, but let's continue to work on a transition plan. I think that's what we're talking about. The environment trumps it all. If the resource can't be sustained, we shouldn't be keeping to certain sustainability levels. And we know that there's great uncertainties. The models that we used to have don't work like they used to because of a changing climate and warming waters. Sorry, I can go on too
Thank you,
long.
Mr. Henley. You win the star of the day for the longest stretch to go over time, but we'll fix that another day. That concludes our questioning for today. I want to thank, of course, Mr. Correa, Ms. Burridge and Mr. Priddy for providing us with their testimony today and, of course, answering questions to make the committee that much more informed on this particular topic. So again, thank you to each of you. We'll suspend for a moment now till we change out for committee business.
Thank you.
Meeting suspended.